8.1 Conflicting Claims. By the mid-1700s, Spain, France, Britain, as England had become known, Britain, were trying to keep control of their lands in North America. For the most part, Spain claimed southwestern lands. France claimed lands to the north and in the middle of what is now the United States. Most of the land that Britain claimed was along the Atlantic coast, or what is now Canada. Both Britain and France claimed the Ohio Valley, which you'll see right here, and it's disputed. Both Britain and France claimed the Ohio Valley, a region that stretches about 1,000 miles along the Ohio River from the Appalachians to the Mississippi River. To the French, the Ohio Valley was an important link between France's lands in Canada and Louisiana. The British saw the Ohio Valley as an area for trade and growth. By about 1750, the French sent soldiers to the Ohio Valley to drive out British traders. They also began building forts near the eastern end of the valley. The British viewed this as an act of war. So what caused the British and French to compete for the Ohio Valley? Our next section, please set up your Cornell notes. The French and Indian War begins. One fort that the French built was Fort Duquesne, where Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania now stands. In 1754, the governor of Virginia sent 150 British soldiers into the Ohio Valley to regain control of the area. George Washington, then only 21 years old, led the Virginians. On their way to the fort, the Virginians battled some French soldiers. Washington thought they were part of a larger French force, so to protect themselves, the Virginians quickly built Fort Necessity. Necessity is something you need. They needed protection, so they quickly built Fort Necessity. Within days, the French and their Indian allies attacked the fort. Outnumbered, the Virginians surrendered. This battle turned out to be the start of the French and Indian War. By the mid-1700s, both France and Britain had formed alliances with many of the American Indian tribes in the Ohio River Valley. An alliance is a formal agreement among groups or individuals, an agreement to be allies, like friends. Once fighting broke out, the French and the British asked their Indian allies for help. In 1754, colonial leaders met at Albany, New York, to discuss the war. 7 colonies sent delegates or representatives. Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania proposed what became known as the Albany Plan of Union. He said the colonies should join together under one government in order to fight the French. Franklin's plan was rejected because the colonies were not yet willing to work together. And notice over here that we said that George Washington led the Virginians, not the colonists united, but just the militia of Virginia, the Virginians. So what caused the Albany Plan of Union to be rejected? So an interesting thing about the French and Indian War was a different way of combating. At the start of the war, the British had not yet adapted to fighting in the woods. Their red uniform jackets made them easy targets in a forest. The British road to victory. And if you're looking at this graphic over here, this map, you'll see the French forts, the British forts, and major battles. So British forts are blue, British forts are red, of course. French are blue. And then the battles are marked with this little fire sign. As the French and Indian War continued, the colonists knew they needed more help if they were to win the war. So Parliament, the law-making body of the British government, sent an army to the colonies to help fight the French and their Indian allies. General Edward Braddock commanded the British. In April 1755, Braddock and more than 1,800 British and colonial troops marched to attack the French at Fort Duquesne. Braddock invited George Washington along as an advisor. Washington later described how the soldiers looked in their bright, colorful uniforms, British red and colonial blue, marching off against a deep green forest. The British soldiers had been trained to fight in open fields, not in wooded lands. They were surprised to find that the French fought like their Indian allies, from behind trees and large rocks, basically guerrilla warfare. As a result, the early battles did not go well for the British, and Braddock was killed in the fighting. To win the war, British leader William Pitt sent more troops and supplies to the colonies. Beginning in 1758, the war turned in Britain's favor. British soldiers captured several French forts, including Fort Duquesne. British troops and ships slowly circled around New France, defeating the French at Quebec and then at Montreal. In the closing months of the war, which had spread to Europe and became what's called in Europe the 7 Years' War, Spain joined France in the fight against the British. Britain had a stronger navy, however, and it defeated the Spanish forces in 1762. To make up for Spain's losses in the war, France gave Spain most of its lands west of the Mississippi River. Go to this map. So this down here is going to become part of Spain for a while. The French and Indian War ended in 1763 when the French and the British signed the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris gave Britain most of Canada, all French lands east of the Mississippi River, and Spanish Florida. The French lost nearly all their lands in North America. So what was the effect of the Treaty of Paris? And your next section, more troubles. The end of the French and Indian War was not the end of Britain's troubles in the colonies. In 1763, an Ottawa Indian chief named Pontiac united tribes along the Mississippi River. Together, the Indians took control of some of the forts the British held. They hoped to destroy the colonist settlements around these forts. Britain's King George III tried to end the fighting between the Indians and colonists by making a proclamation. A proclamation is a public announcement. The Proclamation of 1763 said that all lands west of the Appalachian Mountains belonged to the Indians. White settlers already in those lands were ordered to leave. Now, as you can imagine, most colonists ignored the Proclamation of 1763, and thousands more moved west. As a result, fighting among the Indians and the settlers continued. One British leader did not like the way settlers moved into Indian lands, and he predicted that more people would move into the western areas of New York and start a war with the Indians there. Now, the Proclamation of 1763 upset many of the colonists. They believed they just fought a war, the French and Indian War. They believed they had fought the war to keep the French from blocking their settlement of the western frontier. This is why they fought the war. They wanted to go further west. The colonists did not like the British government telling them to stay out of those lands. Colonists were also angered by the new taxes passed by Parliament. The British thought the colonists should help pay for the cost of defending the colonies. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act to raise money for Britain. This act taxed the sugar and molasses brought into the colonies from the West Indies. Remember our triangle trade? The West Indies, now the Caribbean, is on that path. The Sugar Act mostly affected the shipping business of the New England colonies. Many merchants objected to the tax. Still, the British government continued taxing goods in the colonies. Soon it would pass even more new taxes. So how did the colonists feel about the British rule after the Proclamation of 1763? How did they feel about the way Britain was ruling them? In summary, conflicting claims to North American land led to the French and Indian War. Britain defeated France in the war. After the war, Britain issued the Proclamation of 1763, but most colonists ignored it and kept moving west.